November in the Carpathian Mountains does not arrive gently. It arrives like a verdict. The mist rolls in before dawn, thick and cold and absolute, filling the gorges between the rock walls until the stone itself seems to breathe. By the time the first pale light touches the peaks above, the valleys below are still swallowed whole, grey and soundless and sealed, as though the mountain has decided, quietly and without ceremony, that what enters this morning will not leave. The trees on the upper slopes have already shed their leaves. The rock faces are slick with moisture that will freeze by nightfall. And somewhere in that grey, somewhere in that cold and ancient silence, 30,000 men are marching. It is the 9th of November, 1330. The place is a narrow defile somewhere in the southern Carpathians of what is now Romania. A gorge so tight in places that 4 horsemen cannot ride abreast. So deep that the sky above narrows to a pale ribbon of grey between walls of stone that rise 40, 50, 60 feet on either side. The column stretching back through that gorge is enormous. It takes more than an hour for the whole force to pass any given point. 30,000 soldiers, knights in full Angevin plate, Szekely light cavalry, Transylvanian Saxon infantry, Cuman mercenaries, ecclesiastics and lords and servants and camp followers, all compressed into a single thread of steel and flesh and exhausted horses, winding through the stone like a dying serpent that has crawled into a crack in the earth to die. At the front of that column, walking just ahead of the vanguard, are the guides. They know the way out of the mountains, these men. They know every turn of this gorge, every place where the walls close tighter, every ledge above where a man could stand and look straight down onto the heads of the soldiers below. King Charles I of Hungary accepted their offer himself 2 days ago, when the army was lost and hungry and the mountains had become something worse than an enemy, something indifferent, something that simply did not care whether 30,000 men lived or died in its folds. Basarab I of Wallachia had offered the guides as part of a truce. Lead them out by the shortest route. The king had accepted. The guides are walking quickly now. They are not looking back. On both walls of the gorge above, on ledges and outcroppings and flat shelves of stone that no armoured knight could ever reach, something is waiting. Something that has been waiting since before dawn, silent and cold and absolutely still. Not an army in the way Charles would recognize it. No banners, no trumpets, no formation. Just men and women of the mountains, crouched in the grey morning with rocks and logs and short bows and the infinite patience of people who have lived their entire lives in terrain that kills the careless. 30,000 against 10,000. But the 10,000 are above, and the 30,000 are below, and the walls of the gorge are closing in. In a few minutes, the guides will stop walking, and then the world will come apart. This is the Battle of Posada, the ambush that shattered the greatest military force Hungary had sent into the mountains, that ended a king's dream of empire, and that carved a nation out of stone and blood and November cold. It is the moment when a shepherd, as the King of Hungary had so contemptuously called him, proved that in the right mountains, with the right patience, the shepherd does not need to be stronger than the wolf. He only needs to know where the wolf is going before the wolf does. This battle did not just save Wallachia, it created it. It transformed a voivodeship, a borderland, a piece of geography that powerful kingdoms argued over, and turned it into the first independent Romanian principality in history. Everything that followed, Every prince and dynasty and fortress and church that would rise from the land south of the Carpathians traces its bloodline back to this gorge, this morning, this cold. The mountain was the weapon. Basarab only had to aim it. To understand why 30,000 men followed a set of guides into a gorge they had never seen, you have to understand what Wallachia was and what it was not in the year 1330. It was not a kingdom. It was not an empire. It was not even, in the strict legal vocabulary of the 14th century, an independent state. Wallachia was a piece of land caught between giants, pressed against the southern face of the Carpathian Mountains in the north, bounded by the great sweep of the Danube River in the south, and squeezed between the ambitions of the Kingdom of Hungary to the northwest and the crumbling remnants of Bulgarian power to the southeast. It was, in the language of its neighbours, simply Transalpina, the land beyond the Alps, the land on the other side of the mountains, the land that belonged to whoever was strong enough to claim it. For most of the preceding century, that had been Hungary. The Carpathians themselves had made Wallachia what it was. Those mountains are not the gentle, pastoral slopes of the Alps. They are hard mountains, dark and forested in their lower reaches, bare and savage above the tree line, cut through by gorges and defiles that can hide an army or kill one, depending entirely on who knows them better. The southern Carpathians, which form the northern boundary of Wallachia proper, are especially unforgiving. The passes through them are few, narrow, and deeply channeled between walls of stone that tower over anyone moving along the valley floors. In summer, with full daylight and dry ground, an experienced guide can lead a large force through. In November, with mist and wet stone and the cold settling in for winter, the mountains become something else entirely. They become a sentence. For the Vlach people who lived in this land, the descendants of Roman settlers and Dacian tribes who had survived Gothic invasions and Hunnic waves and Avar domination and Byzantine indifference and Pecheneg raids and Cuman occupation and, most recently, 2 catastrophic Mongol invasions, the mountains were not an obstacle. They were home. They were protection. They were the reason this people still existed at all when so many others had been erased. Every shepherd who took his flocks into the high pastures in summer and back down before the November snows knew these passes. Every hunter who tracked deer through the Alt defile knew which ledges were solid and which crumbled underfoot. Every peasant who had fled into the rocks during a raid knew exactly how far sound carried in a gorge, and exactly how invisible a man could become when he pressed himself flat against a stone wall 20 meters above a marching column. This knowledge, bone deep, inherited, practical, was not the kind of thing that appeared in any military manual available to the knights of the House of Anjou. It was not the kind of thing you could import from Naples or Paris or Rome. It was the kind of knowledge that took generations to accumulate, and it belonged entirely to the people Charles I of Hungary had decided, in the summer of 1330, were his subordinates. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about nearly everything that autumn. But the mountains knew it before he did. Into this world, this hard, mountain-edged, perpetually contested borderland, Basarab I had been born sometime around 1270 to a father named Thocomerius, whose origins historians still argue about. The name Basarab itself is of Turkic derivation. Bas, meaning to press or to rule, combined with Aba, an honorific meaning father or elder, and some scholars have proposed Cuman ancestry for the family, given the wave of Cuman settlement in the region during the 12th and 13th centuries.
Other historians point to 4 separate Hungarian royal charters from the 14th century that explicitly identify Basarab as Vlach. The truth is probably that he was both things at once, or neither, or something that the clean categories of modern historiography cannot quite contain. A man of the mountains, of mixed blood and old blood, whose loyalty was to the land south of the Carpathians and to the people who lived there, and to nothing else. What the documents do tell us, clearly and precisely, is what Basarab did. In the year 1324, a royal charter issued by Charles I of Hungary refers to Basarab as our voivod of Wallachia, voivodam nostrum transalpinum, which is the language of feudal subordination. At that moment, Basarab was, at least on paper, a vassal. He held his position by the grace of the Hungarian crown. He owed tribute and military service and the rituals of loyalty that defined the medieval relationship between lord and man. By June of 1325, a new charter had appeared. This one described him as Basarab of Wallachia, unfaithful to the king's holy crown. In the 14 months between those two documents, something had broken. Basarab had seized the Banat of Severin, a strategically vital Hungarian frontier territory on the western edge of Wallachia, and had begun raiding the southern regions of Hungary itself. He had, in effect, told Charles I of Hungary that the arrangement was over. He did this not with a declaration or a letter or a formal repudiation. He did it the way people of the mountains have always settled these questions, by taking the ground and daring anyone to come take it back. For 5 years, Charles was too busy to do anything about it. His kingdom was vast and complicated and perpetually restless, and a recalcitrant voivod in the mountains was a problem for another season. But Basarab understood that the reprieve was temporary. He used those 5 years well. He built alliances. Most importantly, around 1323, he married his daughter Theodora to Ivan Alexander of Bulgaria, binding the two states together through blood and interest. He studied the passes through his mountains. He trained his fighters not in the Angevin style of heavy cavalry and pitched battle, but in the style that the terrain demanded: mobile, light, patient, and absolutely dependent on knowing the ground better than the enemy. He had learned these things, in part, from fighting the Mongol Tatars. The Tatars had taught an entire generation of Eastern European rulers what massed cavalry on open ground could do. But the Tatars had also taught, to those willing to learn the lesson on the other side, that masses of cavalry are helpless in broken terrain. That the mountains that look like obstacles from the outside look like fortresses from within. That patience, properly applied, is a weapon that requires no forging and never dulls. Basarab was patient. He could afford to be. His mountains were not going anywhere. The man on the other side of this equation was, in most respects, the most formidable ruler in Central Europe. Charles I of Hungary. Charles Robert of Anjou, born in Naples in 1288, grandson of Charles II of Naples and great-grandson of the last Arpad king through his grandmother Mary of Hungary, had spent the first decade of his reign fighting for his throne against a coalition of powerful Hungarian magnates who had no interest in being ruled by a 12-year-old Italian princeling with a French surname. He had been crowned 3 times before anyone took the crowning seriously. He had been besieged in his own capital. He had watched his allies die and his enemies grow fat on the disorder of the kingdom. And then, slowly, battle by battle, and charter by charter, and assassination by strategic assassination, he had won. The Battle of Rozgony in 1312 broke the Aber family. The death of Matthew Czach in 1321 removed the last great oligarch. By 1323, Charles was the undisputed master of a unified Hungary, and he ruled it from his new court at Visegrad with the focused, implacable authority of a man who had earned every title he held through blood and will. Under his rule, Hungary became extraordinary. The gold mines of Transylvania and Upper Hungary modernized, incentivized, expanded under new royalty-sharing agreements that gave landowners a stake in their own production, made the kingdom the richest mineral producer in Europe. By the 1330s, Hungarian mines were yielding roughly 30% of the world's entire gold output, 5 times more gold than any other European state. The florin, minted at Kremnica, became the international currency of choice across the continent. Charles ran his kingdom like a man who had learned the hard way that power requires resources, and who intended to make sure he never ran short of either. He was strong, wealthy, experienced, and, in the spring of 1330, bleeding. On the 17th of April, 1330, a man named Felician Czar walked into the royal dining room at Visegrad with a sword. His daughter Clara had been seduced by the young Casimir of Poland during a royal visit, and Czar had decided that the honor of his family could only be restored through the blood of the people who had allowed it to happen. He wounded both Charles and his queen, Elizabeth of Poland, on their right hands. He tried to kill their sons before the guards cut him down. Charles survived. His hand healed. But what happened next revealed something about the king's character that even his supporters found difficult to look at directly. Felician Czar's children, all of them except Clara herself, were tortured to death. Clara had her lips and all 8 of her fingers cut off before being paraded through the towns of Hungary as a warning. The extended family was hunted down and executed in waves. His contemporaries, writing in the years after the Battle of Posada, would describe the Hungarian defeat as divine punishment for this act. They were working backward from the catastrophe to find an explanation that preserved the logic of God's justice. But what the Tsar affair actually revealed was something simpler and more dangerous. Charles I was a man who had been master of his world for so long that he had lost the ability to imagine being wrong. When word came, in the summer of 1330, that Basarab's Bulgarian allies had been destroyed at the Battle of Velbajt on the 28th of July, when the Tsar of Bulgaria, Michael Shishman, for whom Basarab had personally led Wallachian troops into battle, was killed fleeing the field, Charles saw the opening he had been waiting for. His enemy's strongest ally was dead. His enemy had just suffered the humiliation of fighting on the losing side of a crushing defeat. His enemy was, for the first time in years, genuinely vulnerable. And so he said the thing that history remembered. He said it about Basarab, the voivode who had defied him, who had seized his territories, who had refused his suzerainty for half a decade. "He is the shepherd of my sheep," Charles said, "and I will drag him by his beard from his lair in the mountains." The mountain heard him say it. Charles launched his campaign in September of 1330, moving southeast out of Transylvania with his enormous force and the absolute confidence of a man who has never been beaten in the field. His army seized the fortress of Severin without significant resistance. Basarab had made his calculations already, and a static defence of Severin was not among them. Then Charles pushed on, deeper into Wallachia, toward Curtea de Argeș, which was Basarab's seat, his capital, the symbolic heart of everything he had built. The Wallachians applied scorched earth before them. They emptied the villages. They drove the livestock into the mountains. They burned the granaries. What Charles's army found as it pushed south and east across the Wallachian plain was an increasingly empty landscape, inhabited by silence and the smoke of fires recently extinguished, stripped of everything that 30,000 men needed to survive: food, fodder, shelter, guides. Charles entered Curtea de Argeș and found it abandoned. Basarab had retreated into the Carpathians, with his army intact, his people hidden, and his options entirely open. Here, deep in a foreign country, with winter approaching and his supply lines stretched to breaking across mountains he barely understood, Charles found himself in a situation that his victories over Hungarian magnates had given him no tools to handle. He could not find his enemy. He could not feed his army. He could not go forward. He began to understand, for the first time, that he had marched into a problem that could not be solved by force, because the man with the force was the problem. Basarab sent envoys. The offer was, by any reasonable standard, generous. 7,000 marks of silver, the return of Severin fortress, his own son sent to Charles's court at Visegrad as a hostage, acknowledgement of nominal Hungarian suzerainty, peace. Charles rejected it. The rejection was not, in retrospect, entirely irrational. He had a large army. He had captured the capital. He was the most powerful king in Central Europe, and accepting terms from a man he had publicly called his shepherd would cost him something in honour and prestige that he could not easily recover. But it was also, as the next 3 days would prove, the worst decision he ever made. After more days of fruitless searching through a landscape that gave nothing and revealed nothing, with his men growing hungry and his horses beginning to founder on the rocky paths, Charles accepted a different kind of arrangement. An armistice. A ceasefire in the mountains, with one specific condition. Basarab would provide guides who knew the passes, who would lead the Hungarian army out by the shortest route back to the Hungarian plain. Basarab agreed. The guides came. And now it is necessary to understand the terrain through which they agreed to lead 30,000 men, because the terrain is not background to this story. The terrain is the story. The southern Carpathians in November are not mountains in any comfortable touristic sense of the word. They are a barrier. The range runs roughly east-west across the top of Wallachia, separating the Wallachian plain from the Transylvanian plateau behind them, and the passes through them are few and sharply defined. Not broad valleys, but narrow defiles, gorges cut over millennia by rivers into the rock, sided by walls that in the most compressed sections rise vertically 40 to 60 feet above the valley floor. The specific location of the Posada ambush is still debated by historians. Some place it in the gorges of the Loviștea region, others in the Olt defile, others elsewhere along the arc of the mountains. But all serious theories share one essential characteristic. Wherever it happened in a place where the path was narrow enough that a large force could only move in a long column, and where the walls on either side were steep enough and high enough that anyone positioned on them was effectively invulnerable to anything the people below could do. This was not an accident. Basarab had spent, by all indications, the weeks since the Hungarian army entered Wallachia doing two things simultaneously. His main force had retreated strategically, drawing Charles deeper into the mountains without offering battle, burning everything behind them.
making the land work for them by making it uninhabitable for the invader. And at the same time, he had been positioning his men. Not all of them on one side, on both sides, above, on the ledges and outcroppings that a Wallachian hunter or shepherd could reach easily, moving lightly in the dark, but that a mounted knight in plate armour could not reach at all. He had cavalry blocking both ends of the gorge, the entrance and the exit, so that when the column entered and the chaos began, there would be nowhere to run. Forward was blocked, backward was blocked, the walls themselves were the killing ground. And the men on those walls, lightly armed, locally recruited, without the discipline or equipment of professional soldiers, but possessed of something more valuable in this context, which was absolute familiarity with every inch of the ground beneath their feet, were already in position before the first Hungarian soldier stepped into the shadow of the gorge. The guides knew where they were going. The question is, what Charles's army looked like as it prepared to follow them in. The force was impressive, even in its depleted state. The Hungarian Royal Army of 1330 represented the full military capacity of the wealthiest kingdom in Central Europe, and it showed. The core was the heavy cavalry that the Angevin kings had developed, knights in mail and plate, riding war horses bred for weight and impact, equipped for the kind of battlefield where heavy cavalry had been dominant in Western European warfare for 2 centuries. Around them were the Zekulis, a distinct ethnic group within the Hungarian kingdom who provided skilled light cavalry and had been fighting in the Carpathian borderlands for generations. The Transylvanian Saxons had sent contingents, all of them except the Saxons of Sibiu, who had made the quietly remarkable decision to support Basarab instead, and who would spend the next several years explaining that choice to their Hungarian overlords. There were mercenaries of various origins, and there were the Cumans, countless numbers, in the words of the chronicle, a steppe people whose ancestors had settled in Hungary in the previous century, and who, by 1330, served in the Hungarian military while maintaining their own customs and fighting style. Stephen Lackfey commanded this force, serving as the operational commander under the king's overall authority. The Wallachian army that would face them numbered, by best estimates, fewer than 10,000 men. It consisted of cavalry, infantry archers and, crucially, the locally recruited peasants who knew the mountain terrain better than anyone alive, who had been armed with what was available: short bows fashioned from local wood, stones gathered from the slopes above, logs cut from the forest that crowded the higher reaches of the gorge walls. These were not soldiers in any way that Stephen Lackfey or any of his knights would have recognized. They were farmers and shepherds and hunters, men who had never worn armour and who carried no weapons forged in any armourer's workshop. But they were standing on ledges 30 feet above a narrow gorge on a November morning, and the men in armour were 30 feet below them. Physics, in these circumstances, is entirely indifferent to social hierarchy. Basarab's strategy was not complex. It did not need to be. He had watched what happened at Velbazd in July, had been there, had seen the Bulgarian army destroyed by a Serbian force that understood the value of choosing the moment and the ground. And he had learned the lesson that the Bulgarians had fatally failed to learn. You did not fight a stronger enemy in the open. You did not give him room to maneuver or space to bring his numbers to bear. You found the one place where his strength became irrelevance. You found the gorge. You put your people above it, and you waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The waiting had been going on for weeks. Since the Hungarian army had first crossed into Wallachia, since the scorched earth had begun, since Basarab had retreated and refused to be drawn into a battle he could not win. The patience required had been enormous. His people were cold and tired and frightened.
Some of them were farmers who had never seen war up close. Some of them were watching the smoke rising from the direction of their own villages. Some of them were hearing, through the mountain grapevine of rumour and messenger, that the Hungarians had occupied Curtea de Argeș, that the capital was in enemy hands, that the principality itself seemed to be dissolving. But Basarab had held them. He had kept them together in the mountains with the message, spoken, unspoken, understood in the bone, that this was not the defeat it looked like from outside. This was the setup. The mountain was the weapon. Their knowledge was the weapon. Their patience was the weapon. And when the time came, all they had to do was be exactly where they were supposed to be, and do exactly what they had always done. On the night of the 8th of November, 1330, the last night before everything changed, Basarab's men were in position. The Hungarian camp, somewhere in the mountains on the other side of the guide's path, was burning its last fires. The soldiers gathered around them were ordinary men doing ordinary things for what would be the last time for many of them. They were passing the dregs of the wine around, sharing the last scraps of bread, talking quietly in the particular low registers of men who are tired and cold and a long way from home. A knight from the Transylvanian lowlands thought about the wife he had left behind in October, when this had seemed like a quick, punitive expedition there and back before winter. A Cuman mercenary from the eastern steppe said a prayer in his own language to gods that the Hungarian priests around him would not have recognized. A young Saxon soldier from somewhere north of the mountains, on his first real campaign, sat very still and listened to the wind in the rocks, and tried to determine whether the sound he kept almost hearing was the mountain itself or something else. It was something else. On the ledges above the gorge, in the cold and the dark, the men who knew the mountains were not sleeping. They were not talking. They were not praying, or, if they were praying silently, because silence was the absolute requirement of what came next. Some of them had their hands on stones the size of a man's head. Some of them had bows across their knees, arrows already nocked. Some of them had their hands on the ends of logs that had been hauled up to the lip of the ledge days ago, waiting for this moment. They were cold, genuinely, penetratingly cold, in the way that November in the Carpathians is cold. And they were afraid, and they were ready. Dawn came. The guides began to walk. The morning was cold, and the mist was thick, and the stone walls of the gorge wept moisture that would freeze by afternoon. It smelled of wet rock and dead leaves, and the particular sharp mineral cold of high places in late autumn. A smell that the Wallachian men on the ledges above knew, and the knights below did not. A smell that meant, this is our place. This is our ground. This is where we have always lived, and where we will live after you are gone. The horses of the Hungarian cavalry steamed in the cold. Their breath made small clouds that drifted upward and dissolved against the stone. The sound of 30,000 men and horses moving through a narrow gorge is not a quiet sound. It is the sound of metal on metal and leather on leather and hooves on wet stone, and the low, continuous murmur of thousands of men's voices, all compressed and channeled by the stone walls until it echoes and re-echoes and fills the gorge from wall to wall. But above the sounds of the army, if you listened, there was something else. Silence. The birds had been silent since before dawn. Not the ordinary silence of cold birds in cold trees, but the absolute, specific silence of things that know a predator is near and have made themselves invisible in response. The Wallachian men on the ledges had known this silence for their whole lives. The Hungarian soldiers moving through the gorge below had no way to read it. They were listening to their own army. They were not listening to the mountain. The head of the column had gone perhaps 300 meters into the gorge when it happened. The first arrow came from the left wall, high up, and it did not miss. Then the mountain came alive. It was not what the soldiers below had been trained for, not what anyone had been trained for in the tactical vocabulary of 14th century Central European warfare. There was no opposing line. There was no cavalry charge to countercharge. There was no flank to turn or centre to hold. There was simply the gorge and the stone walls, and from the stone walls there was suddenly an absolute, torrential, unceasing downpour of death from above. Arrows from both sides simultaneously, aimed down into a mass of men and horses so densely packed that it was nearly impossible to miss. Rocks, not pebbles, but boulders, some of them the size of a man's chest, rolling and bouncing down the steep walls and into the column with the physics of falling objects that nothing in armour could stop. Logs, whole tree trunks, launched from the ledge tops and tumbling end over end into the packed mass of horses and knights below, where they hit with a sound like a siege weapon and took entire sections of the column off their feet. The horses went mad first. A warhorse is trained for many things: for the noise of battle, for the press of bodies, for the smell of blood. But a warhorse is not trained for a boulder the size of a millstone falling from 60 feet above and landing 3 meters away. The horses in the vanguard screamed and bolted, and because the gorge was too narrow to bolt sideways, they bolted forward and backward simultaneously into their neighbours, and the neighbours bolted into their neighbours, and in 30 seconds the front third of the column had become a heaving, screaming chaos of panicking animals in cramped space, and the men on those animals had more immediate problems than the men on the walls above. The knights dismounted, those who could, those who were not already down, those whose horses had not carried them sideways into the rock walls. But dismounted heavy cavalry in a narrow gorge is heavy infantry in a narrow gorge, which means men in full armour standing on wet stone in a space barely wide enough to swing a sword, with rocks and arrows coming from 2 directions they cannot reach, trying to form a defensive line against an enemy they cannot see. By mid-morning of November 9th, the Hungarian advance had stopped completely. The Wallachian cavalry blocked the exit ahead. The Wallachian cavalry blocked the entrance behind. And from both walls of the gorge, the rain of stone and arrow and timber did not stop. It was methodical in the way that gravity is methodical. It did not tire, it did not fear, it did not require courage or training or even much aim. It required only that the men on the ledges above keep picking up what was on the ground beside them and letting it fall. And there was a great deal on the ground beside them, because they had been placing it there for days. The Hungarian commanders tried everything the tactical manuals offered. Archers among the Hungarian force shot upward at the walls, but shooting upward into mist at men pressed flat against rock that matched their clothing is nearly impossible. And the few Wallachian casualties from this tactic did nothing to slow the onslaught. Some of the more physically capable soldiers, not the knights, who were too weighted down, but some of the lighter armed infantry, attempted to climb the walls. The walls were wet. The walls were nearly vertical. The walls had men on top of them who pushed off anyone who got within reach. The walls won every time. The gorge was filling, not with water, with the dead. By noon on the 9th, the knights who had been in the vanguard were in the worst position. They were the furthest from any exit, the most heavily armed, and therefore the most exhausted from fighting in full plate in a confined space. And they had the longest to go if they tried to retreat. Some of them were already down, not from wounds necessarily, but from the accumulated impacts of rocks that had struck armour hard enough to stun, from horses that had fallen on them in the panic, from the simple crushing weight of men and animals in a space built for neither. The wounded could not be evacuated. There was nowhere to evacuate them to. Hours passed. The mist thickened as the day wore on instead of thinning, as it sometimes does in the Carpathian gorges in November, when a cold front moves in from the east and pins the moisture against the stone. By afternoon, the light was failing already. November at this latitude gives you perhaps 8 hours of usable daylight, and half of them were gone. The Wallachians on the ledges rotated. Fresh men came forward, rested men who had been waiting further back on wider ledges, and they brought fresh supplies of stone. The whole operation was, in its terrible efficiency, almost impersonal. It was not about the men below. It was about the gorge and the walls and the weight of falling things. It was the mountain doing what mountains have always done to things that enter them without understanding. But then there was the second day. If the first day of Posada was chaos, the second was something worse. It was understanding. By the morning of November 10th, every surviving Hungarian soldier in the gorge understood exactly what had happened to them and exactly what their options were. Their options were 3. They could stay where they were and continue to absorb the rock and arrow fall from above, which was killing them steadily and would keep killing them. They could attempt to fight their way forward, past the Wallachian cavalry blocking the exit, in an exhausted, depleted column without the room to form a proper charge. Or they could attempt to fight their way back the way they had come, in the same cramped column, uphill, past the same blocking cavalry. All 3 options led to the same place. The Hungarian lords, and there were many of them here, among the greatest nobles in the kingdom, men who had inherited their titles from fathers and grandfathers, and who held estates the size of counties, began to die in the order in which they had entered the gorge. The voivode of Transylvania, one of the most powerful men in Hungary, died in the Posada gorge. The priest who had accompanied the king died in the gorge. Knights whose names appeared in royal charters and land registers and church records across the Hungarian kingdom died in the gorge, identified later by their armour or their heraldry, or the testimony of the few survivors, some of them not identified at all. The rain of stone and arrow did not discriminate. A lord died the same way a mercenary died. An ecclesiastic died the same way a Cuman cavalry scout died. The armour that signalled rank and conveyed status in the world Charles I had built was irrelevant here, because the rock coming from 60 feet above did not know the difference between a baron and a foot soldier, and frankly did not care. By nightfall on the 10th, the coherence of the Hungarian force was gone. What remained in the gorge was not an army. It was a mass of men, hungry, wounded, terrified, and completely unable to do anything that armies do. There was no more command structure to speak of. There was no reserve to bring forward. There was no flanking manoeuvre available, no tactical innovation possible, no brilliant generalship that could redeem this situation, because the situation had been decided before the first man entered the gorge. The outcome had been determined by the guides, by the walls, by the cold mathematics of weight and height and the particular patience of people who have everything to fight for and nowhere else to go. On the 11th of November, the killing continued. It continued with the specific, grinding relentlessness of a siege, except that it was the army in the field that was being besieged, trapped in stone rather than behind walls. And the people doing the besieging were standing on the battlements of a fortress that nature had been building for millions of years. The surviving Hungarians were trying to survive hour by hour. Some fought back with desperate bravery, rushing toward the walls and hacking at rock that could not be hurt, shouting at enemies they could barely see. Some collapsed into themselves, sitting against the gorge walls in the attitudes of men who have made their peace with what is coming. Some tried to bargain, calling out in Hungarian and German and Latin to the figures on the walls above, offering ransom, offering surrender, offering anything. The arrows answered. By the third day, November 12th, Charles I of Hungary had been watching his army die for 72 hours. He had been in the column since it entered the gorge, protected by a bodyguard that had been doing its job with extraordinary devotion, absorbing arrows and blows meant for the king, throwing themselves between Charles and the death falling from the walls above. His best knights were dead or dying. His commanders were gone. His force, the 30,000 men he had led out of Transylvania with such absolute confidence only weeks before, was finished. Not defeated, finished. There was a difference, and Charles, in the gorge on the 12th of November, understood it for the first time in his life. He looked at what remained of his bodyguard. He looked at the walls above. He looked at the man beside him, Desiderius Haydarvari, one of his most trusted knights, a man who had served him for years with the particular loyalty of someone who has bet everything on a single master and has no intention of losing that bet. Charles Robert of Anjou, King of Hungary and Croatia, master of the wealthiest kingdom north of the Alps, removed his royal robes. He removed the insignia of his office, the marks of his kingship, everything that identified him as the most powerful man in Central Europe. He handed them to Desiderius. The king was no longer the king. Desiderius put on the royal garments without a word. He was not, by this act, pretending anything. He was not attempting a deception with any realistic expectation of success. The Wallachians on the walls above could see the royal garments, and the royal garments were a target. And Desiderius knew what a target meant in a gorge where the arrows had not stopped falling for 3 days. He was making a choice that had only one possible outcome for him, and one possible outcome for the man standing beside him. And he was making it anyway. He straightened. He moved toward the open center of the gorge. The arrows found him almost immediately. He died, as the chronicle would later record, under a hail of arrows and stones. In the chaos of that moment, in the screaming and the falling and the absolute unceasing violence of the stone walls working on the remnants of the army, Charles moved. Not running, because running in a gorge full of the dead is not possible. Moving. Lightly armed now, stripped of the royal colours, indistinguishable in the grey November confusion from any other survivor. Flanked by the few men still alive who knew who he was and had decided, each of them, to die before they let him die. One of those men was Nicholas, son of Radoslav. He is mentioned in a royal charter issued on the 13th of December 1335, 5 years after the battle, when Charles sat safely in his court at Visegrad and dictated the memory of the worst day of his life for the official record. Nicholas, the charter says, fought off 5 Wallachian warriors who had gotten close enough to use their swords. 5 men, one at a time or all at once, the charter does not specify, and Nicholas held them long enough for the king to move past, to keep moving, to reach the mouth of the gorge and the open ground beyond it. The king escaped. He escaped in dirty civilian clothes, on foot or on a horse he had borrowed from someone who no longer needed it, with a handful of men around him that could be counted without running out of fingers. He made his way back north through the mountains toward Transylvania, toward Hungary, toward Visegrad, where he would eventually arrive and try to explain to his court what had happened to 30,000 men in the mountains south of the Carpathians. Behind him, in the gorge, the last sounds were fading. The men who surrendered were taken prisoner by the Wallachians. The men who did not surrender continued to die. By the afternoon of November 12th, when the noise of fighting had finally ceased and the gorge had returned to the silence it had held before dawn on the 9th, what remained was a landscape of the dead, on a scale that people who saw it in the days that followed would struggle to describe. The rock walls were stained. The floor of the gorge was uneven with what covered it. The Wallachians moved through carefully, taking the things that could be taken, and there was a great deal to take, because the wealthiest army in Central Europe had been destroyed here, and the wealth was still on the bodies. The chronicle lists what was gathered: weapons and precious clothing, silver and gold coins, costly vessels and decorated belts, purses heavy with money, horses with their saddles and bridles, all of it carried back up through the gorge to be laid before Basarab I, voivode of Wallachia, who stood and watched his people carry the remains of Hungary's pride up to him in armloads. He had defeated 30,000 with 10,000. He had done it without a pitched battle. He had done it with stone walls and patience, and a set of guides who knew where they were going. The gorge was silent by the evening of November 12th, and the silence that settled on it was different from the silence that had preceded the battle. That earlier silence, the silence of November 8th, of the last fires and the last prayers and the last ordinary conversations of men who did not know they were about to die, had been a silence full of something, full of everything that living people carry inside them: fear and hope and hunger and cold, and the ordinary texture of human life going on in hard circumstances. This new silence was emptied out. It was the silence of a place that has done what it was built to do, and is resting now, indifferent, patient, already beginning the long, slow process of forgetting. The Wallachian fighters withdrew from the ledges and the gorge with the same quiet discipline with which they had arrived. They took their wounded and their dead. They took the weapons and the valuables. They left the gorge with what it had earned. The November cold would do the rest. Within days, frost would begin the work of preservation and concealment that spring thaw would eventually undo and redo and undo again over the centuries to come, until the specific resting places of the voivode of Transylvania and the hundreds of knights and thousands of soldiers who died in those 4 days would become, as most of the medieval dead become, simply part of the ground. The numbers are imprecise, as medieval casualty figures always are. The chroniclers say the losses were enormous, most of the army, in the phrase of the sources, with the survivors reduced to the few who managed to exit before the blocking cavalry could be brought fully to bear, and the very few who were taken prisoner rather than killed. The voivode of Transylvania is confirmed dead. The king's priest is confirmed dead. Of the great lords who rode into Wallachia that autumn, very few rode back out. What we know with certainty is this:
Charles I of Hungary arrived back in Visegrad in the state that the chronicle describes as clad in dirty civilian clothes. He arrived without an army. He arrived without the insignia of his office, which was still somewhere in a gorge in the Carpathians, on or near the body of Desiderius Hedevari. He arrived having presided over the complete destruction of the largest force he had ever assembled, and he arrived knowing that the man he had called his shepherd, the man he had promised to drag from the mountains by his beard, had not even needed to fight him directly. The mountain had fought him. The mountain had won. The charter Charles issued on December 13th, 1335, 5 years after the battle, carefully and specifically naming Nicholas, son of Radoslav, as the man who saved his life, is a document unlike almost anything else in the medieval royal archive. Kings do not typically commit to parchment the detailed personal memories of their worst humiliations. The fact that Charles did so, that he dictated the specific details of his escape, the soldier who fought off 5 men, the moment of the flight, the gratitude he had carried for half a decade, suggests that the experience had embedded itself in him in a way that his other campaigns had not. He had been at Rozgany in 1312. He had fought the oligarchs for years. None of those memories required a charter to preserve them. Posada did. The shock in Hungary was proportional to the confidence that had preceded it. This was not a frontier skirmish or a cavalry defeat in a lost battle. This was the systematic destruction of 30,000 men by an enemy that the king had publicly dismissed as his livestock. The financial power of Hungary, those gold mines, that florin, allowed for recovery. The kingdom rebuilt its military quickly and was engaged in conflict with the Holy Roman Empire by 1337, which tells you something about the speed of Hungarian institutional resilience. But Charles never led another expedition into Wallachia. He never tried to reclaim what he had lost there. The nominal suzerainty persisted on paper. Hungarian kings would continue to claim authority over the voivodes of Wallachia for decades. But the reality of what that claim was worth had been demonstrated in a gorge on November 9th through 12th, and everyone knew it. In Wallachia, the damage was real. Curtea de Argeș, Basarab's capital, had been partially destroyed during the Hungarian campaign. Archaeological research confirms that Basarab relocated his seat to Campalung after 1330, and the reconstruction of Curtea de Argeș did not begin seriously until after 1340. The principality had survived, but it bore the marks of what it had cost to survive. Basarab himself moved quickly from survival to assertion. His son-in-law, Ivan Alexander, with Wallachian backing and the credibility that Posada had lent to Basarab's reputation across the region, seized the Bulgarian throne in February 1331. With Basarab's continued support, Ivan Alexander campaigned successfully against the Byzantine Empire in 1331 and 1332. The man who had been dismissed as a vassal was now the kingmaker of the Balkans, not because his army was the largest or his treasury the fullest, but because he had done the thing that everyone in the region now understood he was capable of doing. He had destroyed 30,000 men with patience and stone walls and the knowledge of his own mountains. The relationship between Wallachia and Hungary remained hostile and unresolved for more than a decade. The formal reconciliation did not come until 1344, when Basarab sent his son Alexandru to Visegrad to negotiate a modus vivendi with the kingdom that had tried to swallow his principality and choked on the attempt. Even then, the independence of Wallachia was not a gift from Hungary. It was a fact on the ground that Hungary had decided to accommodate, because the alternative, another expedition into the Carpathians, was not something any Hungarian king could propose with a straight face
after Posada. Centuries have a way of making things clear that were murky in the moment. What happened at Posada in November of 1330 was not simply a battle. It was a birth. The immediate military consequence was straightforward. Hungary lost 30,000 men and abandoned its territorial ambitions east of the Carpathians. The immediate political consequence was similarly clear. Wallachia ceased to function as a Hungarian vassal in any meaningful sense, and began to function as a sovereign state, making its own foreign policy, forming its own alliances, building its own institutions. The historian Tudor Szelagian has written that Posada sanctioned the independence of Wallachia from the Hungarian crown and altered its international status irreversibly. The historian Vlad Georgescu calls Wallachia from this moment the first independent Romanian principality. Both of them are describing the same thing from different angles, a before and an after, with the gorge at Posada as the dividing line. But the longer consequences run deeper and stranger than the immediate political settlement. The dynasty that Basarab founded, the House of Basarab, named for the man who stood on the morning of November 13th and watched his people carry Hungarian treasure out of the mountains, ruled Wallachia for more than 2 centuries after Posada. In those 2 centuries, the principality produced rulers whose names became famous far beyond the Carpathians. Mircea the Elder, who ruled from 1386 to 1418, fought the Ottoman Empire to a standstill in the years when the Ottomans were consuming the Balkans kingdom by kingdom, and held Wallachia's independence through a combination of military skill, diplomatic flexibility, and the same fundamental reliance on terrain that his ancestor had demonstrated at Posada. And then there was Mircea's descendant, the one whose name travelled furthest, Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, son of Vlad Dracul, grandson of Mircea, the man who impaled his enemies and struck terror into the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II with the specificity and creativity of his violence. The man whose name, filtered through Bram Stoker's Gothic imagination, became a synonym for the undead in every language on earth. Vlad the Impaler was the great-great-great-grandson of the man who had stood on those Carpathian ledges in November 1330 and waited for 30,000 men to walk into his gorge. The region between the Dniester and the Prut rivers, which today comprises the Republic of Moldova, is called Bessarabia. It takes its name from the Basarab dynasty, a geographical inheritance from a family whose founder did not, by any conventional metric, seem like the kind of figure who leaves his name on maps for 7 centuries. What the Battle of Posada teaches, what it has always taught to those willing to read it carefully, is something about the relationship between power and knowledge. Charles I of Hungary had more of the first than anyone in Central Europe. He had gold and armies and charters and the blessing of the Pope and the prestige of a dynasty that had conquered one of the great medieval kingdoms from scratch. He had, in other words, everything that the conventional accounting of power would have put on the asset side of his ledger. But Basarab had something Charles did not. He had the knowledge of his mountains. He knew every ledge above the gorge and every narrow place in the pass and every wet face of stone where a man in plate armor would find no purchase. He knew how sound moves in a defile and where to position blocking cavalry, and how cold it gets on a Carpathian ledge in November, and how long a man can hold that position if he has enough conviction. He had spent his whole life in that terrain, as had his father, as had his father's father, as had every generation of Vlach people going back to the Roman withdrawal in the 3rd century.
That knowledge was not transferable. It could not be bought with Hungarian florins or conquered with Hungarian knights. It lived in the people of the mountains, and it lived nowhere else. From the gorge at Posada, a nation was born. Not from a treaty or a proclamation, but from the mathematics of falling stone and the patience of people who knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. The Principality of Wallachia, the first independent Romanian principality, the foundation on which modern Romania would eventually build itself, was established not by words, but by 4 days in November, by guides who knew where they were leading, by men and women on ledges in the cold and the mist, by the absolute, complete knowledge of home. The mountain does not remember the names of the men it swallowed. Stone is indifferent. The gorge through which 30,000 soldiers marched on the 9th of November 1330 looks today much as it looked then, narrow, cold in November, sided by rock walls that still rise 40 feet above any man walking the valley floor. The moss on the stone is old. The silence is the same silence. But the mountain did its work. And the nation it helped to create is still there. Centuries later, if you stand in the gorge at Posada on a November morning, when the mist still curls along the rock walls and the cold bites through every layer of clothing, you might understand, finally, why Basarab never had to fire a single arrow himself. The mountain did it for him.